Now, in response to a report released by Transparency International, which states that active enforcement against foreign bribery has significantly decreased on a global scale since 2018, lobby group Corruption Watch has noted that there has been limited progress in South Africa. It believes it remains relatively easy for South African companies to engage in corruption when conducting businesses outside of the country's borders. For more on this, I'm joined by Corruption Watch's Head of Legal and Investigations, Karam Singh. Karam, good evening, and thank you very much for joining us on the Newsfeed Late Night.
Good evening, and thanks for having me.
How widespread is this phenomenon of bribery of foreign public officials in South Africa, as we are talking there about following the money of the UIF?
Well, in the South African context, in terms of how widespread it is, I think that's information that we don't really sit with at the moment. I mean, one of the things that came out in this report, which is a study of the leading exporting countries who've signed on to the OECD anti-bribery convention, is that there's not sufficient transparency around the types of enforcement actions that are taking place. So if we look back on the last 5 years or so, it's been reported that a number of cases have been underway, but we haven't seen any successful arrests or any successful prosecutions relating to foreign bribery in South Africa, which points to the fact that active enforcement at the moment is significantly down.
Yeah. These multi-country bribery schemes, how do they actually operate? And we'll get to the enforcement in just a moment. But for somebody who doesn't understand what is actually happening, how do they actually operate?
Well, I mean, it can operate in any number of contexts, but I mean, a classic example is that a foreign company coming into your country to do business cozies up to an authority that provides a license or is able to pay a bribe to an MEC or a minister in order to get an approval. I mean, the types of schemes that we saw as alleged with the Gupta family and with senior politicians in some ways points to the type of bribery, quid pro quo type situation that's not uncommon and has been subjected to a lot of international scandals over the last couple of decades.
Now, if you look at about a decade ago, when you're talking of enforcement, some of these companies were actually caught red-handed and they were exposed to some extent, and you're talking big names here in terms of multi-international. Even though being caught red-handed, they seem to not have stopped.
No, I mean, they haven't. And, the part of the challenge is that there's not much in the way of incentives for companies to come through and disclose. So you have very strong legal regimes in terms of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the U.S. and the Bribery Act. But, what we're seeing as a kind of innovation in some jurisdictions is this idea of deferred prosecutions, where companies are actually encouraged to come forward and disclose, and then on the basis of that cooperate with law enforcement and prosecuting authorities to pursue investigations that may lead to prosecutions down the line. But at the moment, there's very little incentive, and unfortunately, crimes like bribery are very difficult to investigate and very difficult to detect in a context where people aren't forthcoming with information.
Now, in a country like South Africa that really relies to an extent a lot on foreign direct investment, I beg your pardon, how does corruption of this nature impact on the growth of the country, but also how does it impact on the resources, particularly the public resources of the country?
Look, in terms of the findings of this report, I mean, basically you're talking in the previous segment about the rule of law. I mean, fundamentally, bribery of this nature undermines government institutions, it misdirects public resources, it slows down economic development, it distorts the type of investments we want to see across borders, and it'll deters fair competition and the functioning of the market. So it has a potentially devastating effect of just diverting resources into private hands for private gain.
Now, in terms of enforcement, corruption-wise, is your view that we need a little bit more robust kind of tackling of this challenge. Highlight for me what you see as key gaps. Particularly, I mean, for me, I would think international cooperation when it comes to these issues is quite key and crucial, and without that, successful prosecution might not be possible.
Absolutely. International cooperation is critical, and I think, this is what's happening behind the scenes now in terms of a push to try to get some accountability from the Guptas. Are we getting cooperation from the jurisdictions where they've taken their money and the jurisdictions where they reside? I think the other area is around notions of beneficial ownership. So who is the owner behind the corporate entity that's receiving funds? Could we set up a central registry around beneficial ownership so that there's more disclosure, so that we know where funds are going and where funds come from? These are the types of reforms we're seeing in the campaign finance area, and I think with that type of disclosure, we'll get more benefits in terms of the type of investigations that need to follow.
Now, there's a register called the Central Public Beneficial Ownership Register. How crucial is this tool, and do we have it in place in South Africa, and how is it used?
We have it in place to a certain extent, and it's regulated by the Financial Intelligence Center Act, so it's something which comes under FICA. But I think we're looking for more obligations to be placed upon private entities to disclose information around beneficial ownership. At the moment, it's patchy, it's incomplete, it makes it very difficult to monitor, and it makes it very difficult for then law enforcement to follow the money trail, because in some cases we just don't know the types of front companies that are being set up, who's behind them, and where the money's flowing to. So it makes it difficult to follow the money, which is obviously critical to any kind of financial investigation.
Out-of-trial resolutions, and is what you alluded to earlier on, saying, well, most of these companies manage to do that and they reach these out-of-trial settlements. Are they tough enough, and what needs to be done to, I suppose, make them a little bit tougher?
I don't think they're probably not tough enough. I think the sanctions are not significant enough to deter the practice. If it was, then we would see less scandals around foreign bribery. So certainly, the issue around settlements is that to prosecute these cases can take so long. So there is some benefit to the settlements, but as we saw in the Siemens case, the agreement that gets struck, there must be some level of disclosure so that we can understand who did what. Otherwise, we can have no real accountability if these agreements go under seal and we can't understand what happened. So it's a bit of a balancing act because of the challenges around prosecutions. But we also, we do need to incentivize companies to come forward, and a kind of potential law reform area in this notion of deferred prosecutions is something that we could look at in order to ensure that there are more disclosures.
Now, in this we really can't be speaking of post-COVID because COVID is still here, but in this recovery and redevelopment of the South African economy, how can tightening the screws on this actually help us in any way? Because everybody will be asking, well, I mean, should we pay attention to this? Is this going to help? Is this going to bring money into the country?
Look, it's going to be a balancing act. I mean, I think that the issue ultimately goes down to the rule of law and the power of our law enforcement agencies, whether that be the SIU, the Hawks, or the MPA. Are they working in coordination? Are they in contact with law enforcement colleagues in other countries? Are they engaging with information flowing from SARS and from the FIC, as we understand is meant to be happening at the fusion center? So obviously, we need to see increased foreign investment. We need to get the economy going. But as we saw with the procurement fraud at the beginning of the lockdown, if you lessen the rules, if you make it easier for transactions to take place, you do create the possibility for more risks around fraud and corruption. So, we need to have the balancing right, but we also need to ensure that we have effective law enforcement to deal with these issues down the line, and also to hold South African companies that are working overseas to account and to understand that they're accountable to the Constitution and the laws of the country.
Karam, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us. Karam Singh with Corruption Watch is head of legal and investigation.